Hi everybody, and welcome back to NorCal Slot Car Scene. Last week we started a three-part series on 32nd scale slot car motors. In that first part we discussed the specs and the applications of the various motors that we use in 32nd scale slot car racing. Today we're going to talk about performance, getting the best lap time out of a specific motor, and why one motor may be better for the type of track and the cars that you're running. So as a quick review, we talked about the four basic motors being the FC130, the FK180, the Flat 6, and the FK050. And in that video, we referred to them by their more common name, that being the short can, long can, flat 6, and slim can. So that's what we're going to refer to them going on. Now when it comes to performance, there's a lot of factors involved. And the first one that pretty much everybody looks at, kind of like horsepower in cars. The first thing you look at is the RPM. And does RPM really make that motor faster on the track? And not necessarily so. We're going to look at the torque, how much pulling power, so to speak, that a motor has. Very similar to torque in a full-size car. The physical weight of the motor, that comes into play a lot in how the car handles. So you may not want to use a motor that's too heavy, because it just does not make for a great handling car. The lighter the car, typically the better, and you can place the motor weight where you want to. A very important factor if you're racing on a plastic track or a track with magnetic braid is magnetic downforce. If you're racing on a wood track with non-magnetic braid, this will make zero difference. So we'll talk about all four of these factors and how they come into play and how they are influenced by the different motors that we have available. RPM is a major factor in slot car racing motors, but it can be a little bit overrated in that all four of these motors can have RPMs ranging from about 12,000 up to 50,000. This is the typical range of the motors, the short can in the 20 to 23,000 range, 23,000 RPM range, and so on. But like I said, you can make any of these motors have extremely high RPMs. So RPM by itself is not the only factor in the performance of a motor. Torque may be as much, if not a bigger factor in how fast the motor is. And torque is basically dependent on the size of the magnets. The short can motor has fairly small magnets in relation to the long can motor, and you can see that these two motors, which are stock motors out of a Scale Auto and a Thunder Slot car, the long can motor has almost twice the torque, so it has that pulling power. And that's why you see, like in the NSR cars that offer a long can and a short can motor in the same car, you can get an NSR McLaren with a short can 25K motor or a 21,400 RPM long can motor. But the long can motor has so much torque, in my opinion, it's actually a faster motor on the track. I know a lot of clubs use an RPM limit in some of their classes, and in my opinion, because of what we just talked about, unless you're talking about short can compared to short can or long can to long can, an RPM limit is a very poor way to pick motors in terms of what is allowed in a specific class. The Flat 6, being roughly the same length as the long can, but a little bit shorter, has a little bit smaller magnets, but a little bit bigger than the short can, so it typically has a little bit more torque, but it's closer to the short can in terms of torque. The slim can, the stock slim can motors that are out there have very little torque because it's a very small motor. It has small magnets. And so you can see the range of torque basically going from the high with the long can down to the low of the slim can. Now the magnets also have a factor in terms of braking capability. The stronger the magnets, typically the more torque. Stronger the magnets, typically that motor may have more brakes. And you don't always need a lot of brakes because we don't always run full brakes when we run the cars. So, but just keep in mind that the higher torque motors with the larger magnets will typically have more brakes. Weight is not a factor in how powerful the motor is, but it is a factor in how your car will handle. And when you look at the four motors, what really makes up the weight are the magnets. So the same applies from torque to weight. The motor with the most torque is the long can, and it also has the heaviest because the magnet makes up most of that weight. The Flat 6 having a little bit smaller than the long can, 29 grams, and short can 22 grams, and the slim can extremely light at 17 grams. Now, In part 3, we're going to talk about brushless motors, and a lot of people are looking at brushless motors because that lack of weight or that light weight makes the car handle a little bit better. And the other option with a lighter can, like the short can versus the long can, being almost 10 grams heavier, if you need that extra weight or ballast to make the car handle, you can place it down lower so it will actually lower the center of gravity. Even if you add 10 grams to the short can, but that lead or tungsten can be placed lower, so it can be made for a better handling car. So that's where weight comes into play. We talked about magnetic downforce, and again, this only comes into effect if you're on a plastic track that has rails that attract the magnets, or a braided wood track that has magnetic braid that attracts magnets. If you're on a standard wood track or a wood track with copper tape, the downforce makes zero difference because it's not attracted to the track. But this can make a huge difference, up to a second to 2 seconds a lap faster, if you have more magnetic downforce on a track that has magnetic braid or a plastic track. The long can motor has the largest magnets, so it has the most magnetic downforce. And the short can and the slim can, having smaller magnets, has the least magnetic downforce. Now let's take a look at each motor individually after we've looked at some of the general terms. The short can motor, the benefits to it is it's fairly light. It's very compact in length, so it can be used in a sidewinder configuration as well as an angle winder configuration. And because the magnets are a little bit smaller, it doesn't have that ultimate torque of the long can. It has a very smooth power band. It's typically much easier to drive than a long can motor. When you look at the short can motors that are on the market, there are some in the 17 to 19,000 range, and you'll find those in the Scalextric and Carrera cars that you see on the motor here on the left. Or you can get aftermarket motors like Predator, which in my opinion are a little bit better and a little bit higher quality than the stock Scalextric Carrera motors, but come in that same range. So if you're looking to replace a motor in a Carrera or a Scalextric car with just a good solid running motor at about the same power range, then the Predator is a great option. When you get into the NSRs and the Slottits and so on, the motors in those cars typically are in the 21,000 to 23,000 range, and they're very fast. If you're on a home track, which is not typically large, maybe it's in a garage or something like that, this is pretty much all the power you'll ever need. But there's more available. If you want to go for more power, if you're on a big track like we run on some of the commercial tracks, a 25,000 plus motor is available from NSR and other manufacturers, even up to almost 50,000 RPMs, which I've never found a track that I race on that needed more than a 25,000 RPM short can motor. It's plenty of power. It will turn a great lap time and still relatively easy to drive. Now, when we talked about magnetic downforce, these motors typically don't have a lot, but there is a new type of thing. It's not really new, but there are motors available that don't use this traditional ceramic magnets. They're neo or polymer or something like that. And this motor is a B52 motor, is the brand, and it's a 25,000 K, and it has non-ceramic magnets. So it has much stronger pull and more torque, and it is attracted to the rails of a track that has magnetic rails or magnetic braid. At Electric Dreams, this motor is almost a second a lap faster than a standard 25,000 K motor because they have a magnetic braid on their track. So if you are running, if you want to go fast and you have downforce on your track, definitely look, and you want a short can motor, look at something like this. I'm sure there's others on the market, but this is the one that I know of right now. The long can motor, because of the magnets, has more torque, and it has more natural magnetic downforce, even though these are ceramic magnets. It's a relatively smooth power band, but to do that, what we found that if you get a long can, say, for instance, in a NSR car it's geared at 1331, this thing's a rocket, and it's a monster to drive. It's very difficult to handle, even on a big commercial track. It just has so much torque, it spins the tires down the straightaway. So what I've done in my car is instead of going up on the gear from 1331 to 1431 and getting more power and more top end, I've gone down to 1231. That's, in my opinion, it's essentially taken the motor out of the power band and made it easier to drive, not quite as fast, but it turns better lap times. So you can work with gear ratios on these in terms of performance to alter them and tailor the gear ratio of a specific motor to the type of car and the track you're using. So again, it seems crazy, but I've lowered the power by taking it out of the power band, going down to a smaller pinion and getting less power, but it turns a faster lap time. In terms of what's available in the long can, there are some lower powered. Racer Sideways puts a 17K long can in their GT3 cars, so it's fairly mellow compared to the NSR that we just talked about, and great for home tracks. So on a home track, you might be better off going to a lower power if you're using a long can. The typical long can motors in the NSRs and some of the others are in the 20 to 21,000 range in terms of stock, the way they come out of the box if you buy a long can powered car. There are higher RPMs, even again approaching 50,000 RPMs in long can motors if you want to, but I would be reticent to go anything more than a 21,500 motor in a long can on a home track, because I just don't think you need the power and it's not usable. Now, in the long can motors, there are different magnetic effect or different strengths of magnets. This is a graphic from Scale Auto, and they actually rate their long can motors and tell you how much magnetic downforce each one has. So a lot of places don't like magnetic downforce. They don't want to run with so-called magnet cars. But if you need or want that magnetic downforce, it's great. And I think in most applications, a short can motor is probably the preferred motor. But if you've got a track like a plastic track where it has downforce, this may be the way to go. The Flat 6 kind of falls in the middle. It has a smoother power band than the long cans, but a little bit more power. At a lower center of gravity because it's shorter, as you saw in the video that we did last week when we looked at the dimensions of the motor. The cars that use this standard, like the slotted LMP cars and the Racer Sideways Group 5 cars, use the 20,500 motor. So the 20,000 is the range of the stock motors that that are used in cars that come with a Flat 6 motor. And as the other motors, there's plenty of power available if you want it. And you may want to try this, but like I said, I think that 20,500 is a great all-around motor for home tracks. Slim can is something somewhat new because there's not too many cars that have this. There are some of the Polycar uses it in their F1 classic F1 series, and there are a few Scale Electrics cars that use it, specifically the F1 cars. And for some reason, it's in the Ford GT GTLM car, and it's real fast. This is the Predator motor at the 18K range, which if you're going to replace one in a Polycar and maybe want something a little bit mellower, this works great. The Predator motors are great motors. They're very inexpensive, and we use them not in the slim can, but in the short can in our Carrera Scale Electrics in our Trans Am class. We require this as a spec motor, so it kind of levels the playing field. Now, in last week's video, I mentioned that the slim can would not fit in an angle winder configuration or sidewinder configuration, but one of the viewers sent in and called me on it, and he was totally right. The slim can will fit in a sidewinder configuration, and for some reason, I just kind of went brain dead that day. I actually have a slim can 050 motor in an MR slot car sidewinder pod, and I'll be doing a video on this. I'm going to be doing a build-up comparing this to the long can angle winder versus the slim can sidewinder and see how it compares, because it's a higher RPM motor in the slim can, but less torque, maybe easier to drive, and so much lighter. I'll be able to put the ballast where I want it. So again, my apologies. I definitely made a mistake when I said that the slim can was not possible in the sidewinder configuration. When you look at the slim can motors, that Ford GT that I talked about comes with a 25,000 RPM motor, and because the torque is lower, it doesn't drive like a 25,000 RPM short can. It's a little bit less on power, but it goes really fast in top speed, but it doesn't have a lot of brakes. So, and that's one of the limitations to slim cans in general. That has changed, however, is that there are some slim cans out on the market now. This is the Professor motor with neo magnets. So you're getting that braking power back with the non-ceramic magnets, and as well as the possibility of running this on a plastic track where you have downforce. So these are available. These have started to become popular in proxy races. Proxy races is where you send your car in and other people drive it. So you're trying to compete your car against other people with kind of the driver taken out of the equation. And because these are so light, you can ballast them, lower the center of gravity, and they've become real popular in the proxy races, and the cars are very fast, which is why I'm working on that build with the MR slot car McLaren. So this is something not so much in the future, but it's a little bit different because none of the so-called higher-end cars like Slot.it or NSR or Racer Sideways come with these. You're going to have to build this on your own. So that's a quick overview of the motors that we're using in 32nd scale slot car racing. The 4 motors you see here. The short can is the most popular or the most prevalent, and is probably the best bet for most applications, especially if you're going to try to put more power in it because it's such smooth power band and the lightweight. The long can be a real handful, but they're really powerful. But if you are running on a plastic track or a track with downforce, this would probably be the better way to go over the short can because you'll get that more magnetic downforce, unless your rules allow you to run that B52 motor with the Neo magnets in it. Flat 6 in the slotted LMP cars and the Group 5 cars from Racer Sideways. This is just a great all-around motor. They're very smooth. They have that a little bit more torque, and they drive really well. So it's a good all-around motor, but only in the angle winder configuration from Slot.it and from Racer Sideways. And I mentioned before the SlimCan motor. It's a great motor, but this is more experimentation. This is not something you're just going to throw in any car. You're going to have to kind of build a car around this. So you may see some in the future, but who knows? But it's a viable alternative for racing in proxy races or racing in a class where you have a class that's kind of an open class. So that's the performance. We talked about specs and applications last week. So that's a real broad overview of performance of a motors. And all of my experience is on wood track non-magnet rubber tire racing. So keep that in mind. Although I did mention about plastic tracks and so on. But all the experience that I have based on what motors I've recommended and so forth pretty much come from non-magnet wood track racing. Next week in part 3, we're going to talk about brushless motors, and that's a whole new ballgame for slot car racing. We've had brushless motors in RC racing for a long time, and that pretty much revolutionized RC racing. So in the next installment of this series, we'll take a look at brushless motors in the range like this NSR motor is $450 roughly with the motor with the circuit board that is required to make it operate. But there are motors in the $60 to $70 motor range, including motor and circuit board, which may be viable. So we'll talk about how they work, and are they viable for 32nd scale? Are they viable for 24 scale? Or like the NSR motor here, it's already proven that it's a great motor for racing 24 scale at the highest level. So we'll talk about that next week. And this is Jim Rose with NorCal Slot Car Scene, and thanks for watching. I hope you put comments down if you have any questions. I'll be more than happy to answer them. So we'll see you next time at the racetrack.